And we will start with a presentation of Alistair Jones. And Alistair from the Montfort University, he is associate professor, and he will be talking about very actual topic about Brexit. So the title of his presentation is Brexit Breaking Away from Europe. Alistair, the floor is yours. Because the absence of Panos, you will have more time. If you need to have presentation, I will give you some rights to do this.
Thank you, Dimitra. Thank you as well to the Ostroh Academy. Really appreciate the invite coming to speak here. I don't have slides. We're in the middle of a general election in the UK at the moment, and how can I put it politely? All hell is breaking loose. I do quite a bit of media work, and I chaired a hustings last night, and it went on a lot longer than anticipated. My original plan in suggesting this title, Brexit Breaking Away from Europe, was, I will admit, a little tongue-in-cheek. Let's put my cards on the table, first of all. I am pro-European. I think Brexit is the most stupid thing Britain has done in its entire history. And I have taught in Czechia as well as in the UK on this particular issue. I have given conference papers around it. It's just absolute lunacy. Having said all of that, I was an expert. According to the Brexiteers, I was funded by the EU, and I was therefore going to be biased, and I was trying to indoctrinate the British population. I can tell you the amount of funding I've had from the EU throughout my entire career. Pick any number you like, divide it by itself, and subtract 1. So I have never received any EU funding. I did an Erasmus visit once to the Charles University. So in all of this, what I want to do, when I've been at some conferences such as this, it's always looked very positively at Europe and at the European Union. And I think that's great. But I want to flag up a concern, and it's been something that's been rising for me for the past few years, even before Brexit. And this is how within individual countries, dare I say it, the attitude towards Europe and to the European Union is changing. Within the UK, a lot of people equate the EU and Europe as being the same thing. There is a woeful degree of ignorance among the vast majority of the population of the UK about what the EU is, about what it does. And there are assumptions that every country in Europe is in the EU. There are some people that believe Ukraine is already a member of the EU, and that Ukraine uses euros the same as all of Europe does, except Britain, because we were different and we were special. So there's an equating of Europe and EU within a lot of what people in the UK think. And this line of thinking has been encouraged, I would argue, by Eurosceptics, people that didn't want the UK to be in the EU. But what we're seeing across Europe at the moment is a rise in Euroscepticism. You can look at the Alternative for Deutschland. You can look at the National Rally in France, Marine Le Pen, openly critical of the EU and still raising suggestions that France could leave. Brexit could be a thing. Viktor Orban in his Fidesz group in Hungary, again, very Eurosceptical. And although I don't think Hungary would ever leave the EU, that dialogue is being raised. Similar to a lesser extent, I would argue, in Slovakia with Robert Fico. And also then you've got Geert Wilders in the Netherlands with his Freedom Party, and again talking about possibly leaving the EU. So when you've got 3 founder member states with significant parties talking about leaving the EU, you worry about the project and you worry about their justifications. And scarily, some of the justifications are not dissimilar to what Britain was talking about 10, 15 years ago. I think one difference is in Britain, there's this thing we call British exceptionalism. Basically, we're the best, we are brilliant, and the rest of the world should look to us because we are so good at what we do. We are British, we are special, our empire covered the globe. everyone should look up to us, everyone should take our positions and accept that we are special and we are different. And that mentality, that arrogance of a lot of British politicians has been in play for a number of years. One of the interesting examples in the UK, we had a trial where some market traders were basically charged with breaking the rules. They were selling products in a market in Sunderland and elsewhere in the UK using imperial weights and measures, so pounds and ounces rather than grams and kilograms. And they were charged saying, no, you had to use grams and kilograms, whereas the reality was they should have used both. So it wasn't about using one or the other, it was about using both. And they were tried, they were found guilty, they went to appeal, and they won on appeal. And one of the market traders, one of the leaders, came out of the trial after the appeal, having won, and said, this demonstrates that we are British, we are not European. Now, this assumes that being British and being European is totally different. And you have politicians such as Nigel Farage, such as Boris Johnson, who isn't even British, he was born in America. But they also put forward this line of argument that we are British, we are not European, we are separate, we are special. And they ignore history. They ignore all the different invasions of the British Isles by different European groups, and that how our culture of today is so molded by these influxes of invaders, if you want, the importance of migration. But they want to downplay it all. They want to highlight that Britain is special. And we saw this play out during the referendum campaign, where when experts will say, well, hang on a minute, if we leave the EU, we will not have access to the single market. We will have to pay tariffs on our goods going in there. There will be restrictions. There'll be a whole host of things. And that was decried as Project Fear, even though it was accurate. And you look at any third country, you look at Switzerland, for example, the queues of lorries going out of Switzerland, going into the EU are huge. You're normally queuing for 3, 4, 5 hours potentially. And the argument was the same would happen in the UK. No, Project Fear. The EU will be desperate to trade with Britain because we are special, we are British. We've got so many things that they want. To which the question then went, well, what? And that was immediately pushed to one side. But during the campaign, and then even during the negotiations, after we'd voted to leave and it was ratified in Parliament, that the actual negotiation process, there's still this exceptionalism, arrogance was there, that the EU would accept everything that Britain wanted because we are special. And it wasn't the case. Now, at the same time, while demanding this difference, we also have a demand in the UK for regulatory divergence. So if there's an EU regulation on, I don't know, the production of a particular fruit, the British regulation must be different to that of the EU. And it doesn't matter how nonsensical that sounds, this is one of the underpinnings of Brexit, and it's leading to huge problems in the UK. So businesses are having to abide by British regulations, and if they wish to export to the EU, they have to abide by EU regulations as well. And this is causing huge frustration. So in this breaking away from Europe, I think what we're seeing is a core of people that wanted to leave regardless of the damage done. Nigel Farage, one of the most prominent campaigners in Britain to leave the EU, was interviewed on BBC Breakfast News on, I think it was Monday. And he said, no, it doesn't matter that the economy is rubbish. It's our choice because we've left. We're no longer bound by the EU. And this is a problem, because it is doing massive amounts of damage to our economy. And the only good news for the EU is those other countries that have voices, significant voices talking of leaving, are looking at the British experience and going, maybe not such a good idea. Maybe it is problematic. Being a third country is hugely problematic, especially for the previous 40 years when you've been tied to the EU. So Brexit, breaking away from Europe, we have an issue of identity. in that Britain's identity is closely tied to Europe, whether we like it or not. The rest of the world sees Britain as part of Europe, but Britain does not. The UK has always seen itself as being separate. There was a comment made by Douglas Hurd, who was a minor politician in the 1970s when Britain joined the European Economic Community. And he said that we joined the EEC because we didn't know what else to do. And I think as a member, Britain was always a reluctant European. We were never fully committed. We were never fully involved. But now that we've left, we're suddenly realizing just how much we're losing out. And my prediction is we will rejoin the EU, so we won't break away, but the rejoining won't occur until 1st of January 2036. If I'm right, you heard it here first, and I'm a genius. If I'm wrong, you will have forgotten what I have said anyway. And on that point, I shall draw to a conclusion and either open up for questions or whichever you want to do next, Dimitro.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alistair. Yeah, it's time for discussion and questions. If anybody of our participants have questions to Alistair, please, it's time for your discussion. Maybe I have two questions to you. Yeah, I will use my privilege as moderator. And the first question about manipulation of public opinion. Because I have read Peter Pomerantsev, maybe know such media expert. He is very popular in Ukraine. We have few his books translated into Ukrainian. And he wrote that during Brexit, it was a big manipulation of public opinion. And he mentioned, for example, Cambridge Analytica as firm who made this manipulation. So how do you interpret this thesis of Peter Pomerantsev?
Okay, really good question. The first thing to note is the public opinion was manipulated beforehand. What you've got in the UK is a tabloid media, so tabloid newspapers that are virulently anti-European. Their owners are virulently anti-European. So you have had a drip, drip, drip of let's leave in our tabloid media and in some of the broadsheets such as the Telegraph and the Times ever since Britain joined, or if really once, probably since the mid-1980s, when Margaret Thatcher started to have cold feet about some of the things Europe wanted to do, and she didn't understand the European project. So we've had a long-term effect of negative stories about the European Union and its predecessor organizations in our media, and that sets a mindset. So if you're told something long enough, you're going to start believing it. So the EU, I mean, Boris Johnson as a journalist, when he was working for, Daily Telegraph, he was the Europe correspondent. He made stories up. The EU is going to ban bent bananas. And people believe that. I run a game with my students, and I ran it in the Charles University, and the Charles University students were the first class ever to get the right answer. I give 5 stories, all of which have a grain of truth in them, that were published in the British media, but are all lies. But people in Britain believe they're true, and only one of them actually is true. And it's, the carrots being reclassified as a fruit because of Portuguese carrot jam. But all the other stories we tell, making donkeys wear nappies on beaches, fishermen to wear hairnets and condoms, banning bent cucumbers, banning the British sausage, all of those are lies, but they were printed in the British media as if that's what the EU was going to do. So you've had 40 years of that sort of mentality, and that's before we start on Cambridge Analytics. I was at a thing for local government at Parliament when Cambridge Analytics were there were investigations starting at Parliament about them, and we were supposed to be in the room after them, but they overran by about 3 hours, so we were moved. So the manipulation of information has been hugely problematic. The issue is proving it. And Cambridge Analytics, like them or loathe them, have got a very good record of masking what they do. But the reality is there was a lot of media manipulation. There has been an investigation into the extent to which outside forces were involved in the Brexit campaign in manipulation of information in social media. So we've got the Russia report, which the current government is still sitting on. We have not seen the extent to which there was Russian interference in the Brexit referendum. Now, we know there was some there because some of the people that backed Brexit, such as Aaron Banks, were bankrolled by Russian billionaires. So there is that influence there. We have seen that. But actually pointing it down to Cambridge Analytics is proving to be a bit more difficult. But they were pushing at an open door. Throw on top of that the actual campaigning itself. Take back control. That sounds brilliant, but is meaningless. But it appealed to people's hearts. The campaign for Remain was better in. Better in what? And it didn't work. Yes, their whole argument appealed to your mind. So you had to think, you had to reason. The campaign to leave was much more appeal to your heart and to inspire you, even though it was vacuous, even though it was full of lies. And it's just a combination of all those factors, really. And again, you had a population that was split 50-50. Should we still, probably a third saying we should leave, a third saying we should stay, and a third going, we don't know. So, you know, in some respects, the whole Leave campaign was pushing at an open door. But as a quick aside, the calling of the referendum was about keeping the Conservative Party united by David Cameron. That's why he made the referendum commitment. He never expected to carry it through, and then he did. And then, yeah, all hell has broken loose since. So, long-winded answer.
Okay, thank you. I do not have, I don't want to have a monopoly for questions, so maybe some colleagues would like to ask Alistair with Karsten, please.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Alistair Jones. I think you have described a situation that is taking place in all of Europe. This with propaganda and destroying the good European Union, so to say. But do we all agree that if the world leaders also, that Britain had a really good chance to get a main player in the world, but because of very bad leaders, because of very bad prime ministers and etc., they miss it. And it's the same situation in the rest of Europe. We also know it here in Denmark. And if I should say something, that is that then when Britain left the European Union, you left us on the train station, so to say, here in Scandinavia, and it has caused a lot of problems because we are very common societies, and we were a part of Europe that were very important. And after this, the Danish leaders have run around like chickens without heads, and cannot find partners in Europe, and it makes, so to say, the problems in Europe that the leaders are not in sync with the people. And now there is a discussion whether the prime minister in Britain, that is very, very rich, is in contact with the people, and I think that it's the same with the politicians in Europe today. Are they in contact with the people? And suddenly the people will react themselves, so to say, it's only a question for you, and now we are in the country, Ukraine, that is a turning point, so to say. I hope you all know that. And Putin not as strong as you think. And here is the possibility of a new start, so to say, for Europe. So it's very important to be here. But I think that it's not only a thing that is going on in Britain. I think it's going on in the rest of Europe, but in Britain, the propaganda was succeeding, so to say. I hope other dimensions, but it's the dimension I can see from Denmark. And I can tell you that it was very problematic when you left the European Union, because the Scandinavian states and Britain are very close, so to say. Yes.
Absolutely the case. I mean, what I will add,
and you are not forgotten.
that is nice to know.
Yes.
But one thing I will add is, and this was a thing, and it's definitely in Britain, and it may play out in other countries as well, is that even when we had prime ministers who were very enthusiastic about the EU, if there was a domestic problem and they could blame the EU for it, they did. Even Tony Blair, who was arguably our second most pro-European prime minister. So every time there's a problem, rather than saying, hey, let's deal with it, let's blame Europe. And that mentality has made things worse. There was an opportunity for Blair to actually lead Europe, and other leaders looked to him. But he was not willing to waste domestic capital on being the leader of Europe and setting the agenda. He wanted to focus on domestic politics, because for much of it, foreign policy does not necessarily win an election. Domestic policy does. So he was not willing to spend the capital. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of European leaders are not willing to invest that political capital in Europe. Angela Merkel was one who did, I believe, and that she was willing to invest in the leadership of Europe, but others have not taken that on, and that's a problem. So when you've got the likes of Macron, if he's one of the leaders of Europe, we've actually got a problem, because the rest of Europe is not looking to someone like him.
But I hope you all know we are all in the same boat.
At least you're in the same boat together. We're in a slightly different boat that's a hell of a lot smaller and full of holes.
You are not alone, Ukraine. You're all in the same boat.
Thank you very much for the discussion. Maybe some other questions. How do you?
I have one question, if I may.
Please.
Thank you very much for your speech, Professor Jones. And I would like to ask is there any chance after election in UK that UK politics toward Ukraine can be changed? I mean, especially the military help to Ukraine, or there is a strong consensus between all parties that this politics will not change after election?
The commitment
about your opinion about that issue.
In the case of Britain, the commitment towards Ukraine will continue. The commitment to give arms and munitions to Ukraine will continue. And Britain will push NATO to make sure all NATO countries are doing the same. And that is the position from both of the major political parties. Some of the smaller parties, Reform being one, as that's Nigel Farage's party, don't want Britain to do that. The Reform look much more to Putin and his regime, and there are links there. Putin and Farage have got a history together. Farage hopefully will be an inconsequential politician in the future, but he is the figurehead that led to us leaving the EU. I don't see his party winning more than 1 or 2 seats at most. My feeling is they'll win 0, but they will win about 10% of the vote. So the 2 major parties, Conservative and Labour, throw in the Liberal Democrats as well, Scottish Nationalists, Plaid Cymru, they are all of the opinion that Britain carries on supporting Ukraine to the fullest of our abilities, short of sending troops to support, because that would be considered a declaration of war by NATO on Russia, and that's a line they are not going to cross at this point in time.
Thank you very much. In Ukraine, Boris Johnson is hero for many Ukrainians. How do you, what can you say about his politics and his role in Brexit?
Okay, I met Boris Johnson years ago before he was famous, and we had a chat for about half an hour about citizenship. It was really interesting. He was a very clever man. His aide then came in, Mr. Johnson, you've got to go on stage now and give your speech. He looked at his reflection in the mirror in the window, ruffled up his hair, and was suddenly the mad Boris character that people in Britain know today. Boris Johnson is a Marmite figure. You either love him or you loathe him. There is no middle ground. while he committed Britain to supporting Ukraine, and he is rightly acknowledged for doing that, and that has set the baseline for all subsequent leaders to do the same. Putting that to one side, he is the most odious, narcissistic politician I have ever known in UK politics. You may like him in Ukraine for what he has done to help your country, and as I say, we salute him for that. But within UK politics, this is a man who lied to our monarch, who lied to the people, who was busy partying when we had lockdown, and even partying the night before the funeral of the former Queen's husband. So, you know, we've got a person that didn't care about anything else. So the exception being Ukraine, because that could further his image. His sister points out in things that she said that his aim as a child was to be king of the world. And Boris Johnson's raison d'etre is to make Boris Johnson even richer and more famous than he currently is. And sadly, I would say that supporting Ukraine was a stepping stone in doing that. The one positive is that he set a benchmark for all other prime ministers to support Ukraine in a similar manner. So beyond that, you get my gist of what I think of Boris Johnson.
Okay, thank you very much for very interesting presentation and discussion.